on the other side of the debate, and I have to say there's not much of that I would actually disagree with, which is going to be quite an interesting debate. I also think it's a bit of a rich irony that you've asked a Scotsman to defend Magna Carta, so I will do my very best. Now, this is my second trip to Lincoln, and I think Lincoln typifies the Magna Carta. Its winding streets up the hill towards the citadel and the cathedral behind us. It's not a centrally planned city on the Haussmann-esque model. This is an organic, evolutionary city, and that is what Magna Carta is. This is the very essence of Magna Carta, and I think it's more beautiful for that. So this House would have you believe that Magna Carta is irrelevant. As I've said, I have to say, I agree with very much of what Philip has said, and the constitutional mess we've got ourselves in. And I very much liked his line about the rule of Parliament and not the rule of law, or the rule of the executive. I will certainly be borrowing that phrase in future. But where I would differ from Philip is that if Magna Carta is irrelevant, it's been made irrelevant by our politicians and by supranational authority, and very recently. Now, Mao Zedong was once asked about the French Revolution, what impact the French Revolution had had on France. 150 years after the event, he said, it's a bit too soon to be sure. A bit too soon to be sure. And I would say that actually, if Magna Carta has been undermined, it's been undermined in the last 20 or 30 years. And it's just a little bit too soon. The fat lady has not yet sung. Yes, it looks bleak and it looks bad, but it ain't over yet. So, at one level, Philip is absolutely correct. There's only 3 clauses left on statute from Magna Carta, and they're all fairly irrelevant. So perhaps Magna Carta is irrelevant, but I'd ask you to think most carefully about that. I think that Magna Carta remains the cornerstone of the very idea of England, and latterly the British justice and our constitution. I think it's the essence of liberty, I think it's the essence of light government, I think it's the essence of sovereignty, and I think it's the essence of freedom. And if you believe this, Magna Carta cannot be irrelevant. Now, while legally it has undoubtedly been dimmed in this country, it is very much at the cornerstone in many other countries. America is a prime example of that, as is Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and many, many other countries. Its influence from this little root in this country is still profound. And I think it's the cornerstone that's protected many of our liberties. So, if we take Philip's perspective, it's a bit like saying, well, that was that, let's rebuild a new architecture. Well, I would say, let's rebuild the essence of England and Britain around the Magna Carta, around the common law, around liberty, around small government, around peaceful government. They should know that in the old Bishop's Palace that it says in the Book of Common Prayer, let us be governed peacefully and quietly. We are not being governed peacefully and quietly, and those that believe in Magna Carta will certainly want to see us return to peaceful and quiet government. Now, it's true that Magna Carta doesn't say too much explicitly about the common law, but the common law is at its very heart. And I think the common law is critical to this debate because it's not a revolutionary code. It's based on precedent. It's conservative with a small c. It tends to be minimalist. It's fairly gradual and it evolves, but it's able to evolve as circumstances change. And I think this is the unsung genius of Magna Carta, and indeed this country that is given to the rest of the world. It is not based on Napoleonic code, this sort of bizarre idea that we can just sit in this room and come up with some sort of constitution that will work for all time. We'll come up with some good ideas, I'm quite sure. But there'll be some very odd and bizarre ones within that. Far better to look back in time, but also evolve gradually as circumstances change. And indeed, as I think, as the common law slowly subsides and we move into a more codified, bureaucratic society, we're in danger, to quote Goya, of saying, creating a rational monster. Each individual piece of legislation sounds reasonable in itself, but taken together, those 5,500 pages of tax code, for example, it creates a monster. It's not just tax code, it's all sorts of other pieces of legislation, all reasonable in themselves, but we are creating a rational monster. So, what is it, if Magna Carta is relevant today, or what is it about Magna Carta that we should cherish? Well, very much thanks to the Federalist Society, we're about to publish a booklet, and this is a draft of it here, about Magna Carta today, and we'd be delighted to send you all a copy. And I'm not a historian, and when I agreed to do it, I thought, my goodness, what task have I taken on? But then I suddenly thought, there's 63 clauses in Magna Carta, and they're pretty higgledy-piggledy. And what I've tried to do is put them to 10 broad categories. So we've looked at the Constitution, religious freedom, which I think now we would classify as freedom of speech, justice, family life and privacy, property rights, trade and border controls, taxation, the right to inheritance, debtors' rights, which I've called updated the obligations of bankers, and the environment, and there's perhaps a dozen clauses like how you deal with Welsh hostages or something like that, that are perhaps spuriously irrelevant. So what I thought we'd do, we wouldn't go through all 10 because we're here for quite a long period of time, but we'd just look at a few of those topics and see how we're doing. And I think there's a great degree of agreement with Philip on many of these areas. Now, in truth, Magna Carta doesn't say too much about who guards the guardians. It has very little to say between split between local and national powers. A couple of good reasons for that. First of all, the state was very small. I think to mention the word GDP in medieval England you'd certainly get a raised eyebrow. What on earth is that? But the state was certainly not 50% of GDP, which it is today. And of course there was no need for devolution because those pesky Scots weren't involved in 1215. I was probably raiding sheep or something like that then. There's also relevance though, because in 1211, 4 years before Magna Carta was signed, King John surrendered the sovereignty of this country to the Pope. In exchange for 1,000 marks, he leased it back. Now Magna Carta reasserts English sovereignty. And for that reason alone, I think it's highly relevant at this time when so much of our sovereignty has passed to another place. Magna Carta takes for granted English sovereignty, and certainly in temporal affairs, and I think from the break with Rome in 1532 to 1973, England/Britain was pretty well supreme in its affairs. However, since 1973, there's been a steady erosion of the common law, giving way to supranational statute law, directives and regulations as EU competence has grown in a way that I think very few people would have thought possible from when we joined the common market, as it was then called, in 1973. So effectively, the EU has virtually total competence in trade, agricultural, fisheries, environment, single market regulation, health and safety, and quite a lot of influence in aspects of foreign policy, energy policy, transport, economic policy, etc. And under the principle of acquis communautaire, what we have, we hold, power accumulates at the centre, and the centre is not really Westminster any longer. So in terms of constitution, well, I'm afraid Philip is right. Magna Carta has been largely supplanted. But where I would differ from Philip is we need to reassert it, and that's why it's important. Now, religious freedom is dealt with to an extent in Magna Carta. Now, I think we can look at freedom of speech as a modern interpretation of religious freedom. Now, we've been pretty lucky in this country for a long time that we've enjoyed relatively tolerant and enlightened attitude to free speech. However, it has never been true that we've had absolute free speech in this country. You just have to visit the Tower of London to prove that point. You'd have also been rather brave, I think, to have been a Roman Catholic in Elizabethan England. And indeed, the blasphemy laws were only finally cut in 2008, albeit they'd been in abeyance. And if you'd wanted to buy that very risky novel, Lady's Chat of His Lover, you'd have had to go to Soho and put it in a brown paper bag. But I'm sure none of you have ever done that. But I think freedom of speech is now under attack in rather new ways. The codification of hate crime, for example, makes it increasingly difficult to discuss certain areas. Now, I think everyone in this room is perfectly reasonable and tolerant and wouldn't want to offend other people, but it is very important to have debates about immigration, about sexuality, and all these other issues. Increasingly, those ideas have been closed down. And what has also happened is, signing the European Human Rights Act in 2008 codified freedom of speech. And if you read the Act, it's actually perfectly reasonable. None of us could probably be against it. But unfortunately, what then happens is legal creep. So what, helped by my fellow Scotsman, Mr. Macpherson, what then happens is that you can have a debate so long as you are being tolerant and not being offensive to people. But if the definition, we can probably agree in this room what offensive is, you know, but if the definition of offensive then becomes any incident which is perceived as offensive or racist by the victim or any other person, it's quite possible one person in this room has already taken offence that I'm Scottish. And therefore I may have a case against you. I'll see you later. Got a good lawyer over here somewhere. But you see the point. You know, it starts to close debate down.